I declare the meeting open. I bid you, Ms. Djalita, Nandine, Fialho, de Oliveira Ramos, most heartily welcome. You may now give a brief exposition of your research, of your reasons for having undertaken it, and of the results it has yielded.
Thank you. Mr. Rector Magnificus, this thesis set as a challenge to answer these 4 research questions, all of which are related to the under-researched issue of developing country categorization and contribute to the overarching question of what drives the proliferation of developing countries' differentiation within international organizations. Thank you. Equally important, do developing countries' needs represent the main motivation for categorizing countries, or are there other driving forces? Through this research, I have reconsidered initial certainties and gained a new perspective on the UN and on Cape Verde's development. As a result, and contrary to my initial research proposal submitted to the ISS, this thesis is not specifically about Cape Verde, nor specifically about the least developed country category. As a result of research, developing country differentiation became its main focus, having as an angle of analysis the first case of a negotiated LDC graduation under the so-called smooth transition mechanism. The main puzzles motivating this research are 3. Some countries do not want to be considered as LDCs, others do not want to be graduated from the LDC list, and when we look at the UN, we cannot help but notice the growing proliferation of categories of developing countries over the years. In effect, when we scrutinize this issue, the main contention ends up being between developing country differentiation used as a mere policy instrument to introduce greater efficiency in the organization's interventions, or as an instrument of power to safeguard and advance specific interests. In this last case, the thesis reveals that if left unchecked, developing country differentiation can indeed be appropriated for organizations and states' selfish interests. Empirical observations presented in Chapter 1 point to an outburst of such differentiation within the UN starting in the mid-1980s and a persistent proliferation of developing countries' categories from then on. Yet, this change has not been worthy of much academic attention. Based on literature review, hardly any research could be identified on how frequent developing country differentiation or categorization has become within the UN. What we also see as a result of this proliferation is the overlap of categories, which makes it hard to understand which country gets or is entitled to what and why. Ultimately, this indicates a tendency to create new categories of developing countries whenever new development problems are identified. In order to understand the reasons for the outburst of categories of developing countries within the UN, as well as the implications for this research investigates developing country differentiation in terms of 2 main factors, interest and power. These 2 factors are studied separately and in relation to each other and are analyzed through institutional behavior. The thesis uses mixed data collection methods, triangulating primary and secondary data collected through literature review, document analysis, and descriptive statistics, and also semi-structured expert interviews conducted with a total of 34 informants from different sectors. By engaging with the collected data through a political economy analytical lens that highlights the role of power and draws attention to conflicting interests, the thesis finds that continuous categorization of developing countries, besides stimulating further proliferation of categories, also reinforces a sense of entitlement to international support on the part of developing countries. This in turn deepens developing countries for independence and reinforces the power of developed countries over LDCs. This also serves the interests of UN member states not interested in letting go of benefits associated with being categorized as a least developed country. There is therefore a systemic dynamics going on which shows that while UN bureaucracy does act autonomously, the fulfillment of its self-interests is facilitated whenever these interests coincide with those of certain groups of countries. In fact, dysfunctional behavior is reported in all 4 empirical chapters of this dissertation, and this is the aspect that links all these chapters. As to the genesis of the LDC category, Chapter 3 shows that in the end it became more important to design a category of countries that would not budge too much with vested interests than to create a category that congregates countries truly in need of non-reciprocal special and differential treatment. Regarding proliferation, Chapter 4 shows several small island developing states categories created within the same organization, indicating duplication of efforts and wasteful competition within the UN. Despite the coexistence of several SIDS lists, the UN has not been able to agree on consensual definition of SIDS, nor on specific special and differential treatment for these countries, which indicates that bureaucratic motives do drive the process. With regard to Cape Verde, Chapter 5 shows the depth of its foreign dependence nurtured all throughout its LDC trajectory, and how that dependence created power networks and a constellation of interests that initially stood against the country's LDC graduation. Finally, Chapter 6 demonstrates that certain UN structures opposed Cape Verde's graduation, a status upgrade that the organization itself advocates and that represents the purpose for which the category was created in the first place. Cape Verde assumed an equally defensive and contradictory position towards its own development. The thesis concludes that the differentiation created within the UN among developing countries has changed the rapport of power between more advanced developing countries and LDCs. By differentiating and subdividing the general and previously undefined group of developing countries, the establishment of the LDC category created a demarcation between more advanced developing countries and LDCs. This has implications in terms of prioritization of special and differential treatment in favor of the latter. And as a result, the relationship between these two groups changed from partners to competitors. Also, differentiation resulted in disproportionate segmentation of the developing world, considering the large number of categories that emerged, some of which with matching purposes. Chapter 4 investigates the overlap that results from the proliferation of developing countries' categories and the coexistence of several lists of SIDS within the UN. Lastly, we see the institutionalization of an LDC graduation process that, while responding to the interests of graduating LDCs, also safeguards bureaucratic interests and ends up promoting even further proliferation. Chapter 6 demonstrates that graduated countries are still kept under the wings of the UN for an undetermined period of time, preserving the organizational status quo. The implications of all this are that graduating countries and certain UN structures tend to act so as to safeguard individual interests, even if at odds with member states' interests. Also, bureaucratic interests and motives at the state and at the organizational level end up influencing developing country differentiation. And ultimately, this type of dysfunctional behavior might thin out special and differential treatment to countries that really need it. As to the case of Cape Verde's graduation, by shaking up a stagnant category, it generated positive changes within the LDC structure. It made graduation dependent on a new transition framework, which is now being replicated to all graduation cases. This new framework serves useful purposes. It makes transition out of the category not as abrupt as in the absence of such a structure, and it provides predictability in terms of immediate and short-term international support to LDC graduates. This took away the stance against graduation in Cape Verde and at the UN and improved a somewhat frozen structure. It also countered a clear dysfunction in the behavior of some of the UN bureaucracy towards LDC graduations. So the case of Cape Verde shows that the LDC category tends to be addressed as a purely administrative or bureaucratic process and not as a development-promoting instrument that imposes on the graduating country a de facto paradigm shift away from never-ending foreign aid-led development. This denotes resistance to change, inertia, and ultimately lack of broader development thinking on the part of the UN, but also on the part of the graduated country. In addition, it shows contradictions between UN's stated intentions and policy implementation. On the other hand, significant and oftentimes unnecessary differentiation among developing countries within the UN happens precisely because the organization responds to bureaucratic interests, whether or not they concur with member states' interests. In the end, it is the organization and its representatives, and not necessarily most vulnerable states, who benefit the most from the proliferation of developing countries' categories. Therefore, keeping intact or empowering even more certain bureaucratic structures becomes the main purpose. This is a clear subversion of the most important purpose of developing country differentiation, which is a provision of special and differential treatment to countries truly in need of it. However, it is not realistic to think that an overhauling change in the current system of developing country differentiation would be immediately possible, precisely given ingrained bureaucratic interests and well-established national and international power networks. Given the misalignment of interests identified throughout the thesis, changes in the current framework of developing country differentiation should be deep, but they should also be gradual, so that they can be feasible, meaningful, and long-lasting. Mindful of this, the thesis proposes policy changes which could contribute to a less dysfunctional framework of developing country differentiation, which are, for instance, discourage the proliferation of even more categories to prevent further complexification of special and differential treatment, streamline, rationalize, or reorganize existing categories of developing countries within the same organization in order to reduce proliferation, depoliticize, and adopt a strictly needs-based approach to country selection, work towards less institutional fragmentation of efforts and more organization coordination, and hence adopt a tighter control of their performance in order to minimize principal-agent mismatches and introduce more accountability measures targeted at international organizations and at the work of their representatives. Thank you.